I'm Marshall Kozlov.
And I'm Mike Doran.
Welcome back to Counterbalance.
Marshall, today we've got David Asher of our own Hudson Institute. He's right at the center of this major national debate we're having on the Wuhan Institute of Virology lab leak theory. Hi, David.
Hello. How are you?
Good. You know, David, I have been traveling for the last 2.5 weeks and barely following the news. And I come back, I find that you're at the center of this major controversy. For people like me, for me and for people like me, can you just give us a quick synopsis of where we're at in this debate?
Well, it's been months since this deadly unfolding pandemic disaster of COVID-19 began leaking out of Wuhan, China. And the Chinese government's response remains simply surrealistic. It's like a Salvador Dali painting where the clocks have melted, but indeed time has not stood still. And the farther we get away from the originating point, which is still to be determined, but now there's increasing possibility that this actually began in October, which is what Dr. Redfield was saying yesterday to the press and had mentioned to CNN in passing to Sanjay Gupta. We still don't know. And what we do know is that we've made hundreds of offers of help as a State Department. When I was there, literally I counted, I think, about 200 different ways that we approached asking the Chinese what had happened, offering our unrequited assistance, even giving them PPE when they were the ones, asking for it. And it got us nothing. I've never been involved in a bigger diplomatic cover up. I spent 32 years of my life involved in U.S.-China relations since I was in China before Tiananmen and after. We don't have serum cultures. We don't have data. The WHO has been treated like a Chinese plaything and tossed around. And we really don't know what the who, what, where, when, how, and why surrounding COVID-19's origins are. But we do know that the Chinese Wuhan Institute was involved in some very disturbing research into advanced so-called gain of function capabilities of enhancing the lethality of viruses and other deadly pathogens. And specifically, we put out a declassified fact sheet at the State Department under Secretary Pompeo that I could get into in a second if you're interested. And it illuminates several things that
I've actually got that fact sheet right in front of me. But before we get into any of those details, can you just tell us what your personal role in all of this is? How you were? So you've just alluded to the fact.
I came back part-time at the State Department. I wasn't a Trump political appointee. I came in as a consultant. I hired gun because I've run a lot of investigations in my time, and I've developed economic ways and means of putting pressure on adversaries. And so, frankly, it was the last year of the Trump administration. I'm a businessman in addition to a Hudson Senior Fellow, and I wasn't going to sell all my businesses to come in for a year of uncertainty at the State Department, but I was more than happy to come in as this sort of special, they called him senior subject matter expert on investigations for our Arms Control Bureau, which had never really developed the capability to advance investigations, even though by statute we're supposed to. We basically get tethered to the IC, which we work closely with, and they sort of tell us what happened, and then we just report on it in our reports to Congress. I said, we need to do this differently. First, we had to approach arms control differently. And Tom DiNanno, who's now a colleague at Hudson, who was the acting assistant secretary and the senior official in the Arms Control Bureau, and I had a discussion early on, maybe last January, as I was coming back into state. And our approach was to go back to the old Reagan playbook with NSDD 75, which is a seminal document in the Cold War against the Soviet Union, which basically put us on a sort of economic warfare footing against the Soviet Union. We were trying to do something approaching that, which wouldn't involve warfare, but it would be like everything except for warfare against China. So I got brought in with that pretense. I was going to be the pressure guy. I've done that in Iran, as you recall, Mike, when we worked together. I've done it against Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, Connie Network, ISI, Pakistan, and of course, AQ-Khan I was involved with as well. And my most famous one's probably been North Korea. But I'd always wanted to do something in China. So I started working on that. But what became apparent to me, became apparent, was that we didn't really know what had happened in Wuhan. And so I said, I had to do a project on Chinese nuclear deterrence and capabilities as part of our arms control New START talks, which never happened with China, but we were prepared for it. I got that done. And then in the fall, we started looking at, we had this biological weapons convention meeting coming in December. And then we have to generate a report to the Congress each spring, and we needed to work on it well in advance. So I said, okay, COVID-19. I mean, obviously came out of Nature. NIH says that. Fauci, Collins, all the famous doctors, all the scientists signed all these letters. So I said, I knew what Hudson had already done in this timeline. I had my suspicions, but I said, let's just call old NIH up. So I called the associate director of NIH up, and I said, just send me your file, if you could, on origins of COVID-19 and all the evidence you've got as scientists for it coming out of Nature. And then, we can basically write off the possibility that this lab leak had occurred, which the Secretary of State had accused China of and related to Wuhan Institute in April. Well, they had no file. At least they didn't have a file they would share with the State Department. And I started calling scientists all over the country, because I know a lot of them from my work in biotech investing. And I was amazed. Nobody had proof at all. I mean, this is an event that, by the way, there's an event that now is on Hudson's website as of 2:00 today that will be downloadable for a long time to come, with Dr. Stephen Quay and Professor Richard Muller, where they talk about their work and the lack of, on the evidence and the lack of evidence related to natural origins of COVID-19. I've never in history, and they've, as scientists, have never in history seen anything that has more discussion and consensus among scientists that has no evidence.
So all that early discussion about bats and wet markets, that's all just a big cover story.
Well, it's all based on, and even the Nature. There was a paper in Nature. Everyone says it was a paper. It was a letter in March. They had some proof that showed that somehow this wasn't optimized for transmission, and therefore it wouldn't have been a good weapon, as if they knew anything about weapons, the people writing for Nature, a bunch of scientists from the Scripps Institute, which receives huge funding from the Chinese, apparently. I'm not an expert on their funding, but I've heard this. I will see what the truth is, because I will be doing an investigation at Hudson into some of this U.S. government funding. I'm going to do it as a report, not an investigative piece of sort of quasi-journalism, but I want to really look at how we got into bed with the Chinese, especially in the wake of something that was incredibly important, obvious to everybody in the biotech industry, and apparently unknown to anyone in the U.S. government. The French, who built the most sensitive lab, the so-called BSL-4 level lab, where you do the most dangerous pathogen research in all of Asia, okay? It's probably the state-of-the-art facility. We're going to have 50 scientists on site working in Wuhan, training their scientists on how to use this lab. They started construction, I believe, in 2014. By 2017, they inaugurated the lab. And know what happened right after that? The French got kicked out. I mean, our ally in France was kicked out. None of their researchers ever made it to Wuhan, at least as part of this Pasteur Institute group that was going to be working there.
Wait. I just want to make sure that I understand. The French were building a state-of-the-art lab inside the Wuhan Institute of Virology?
The whole new Wuhan Institute of Virology moved from an old building from the 70s to a brand new building in the center of town. It's a whole campus of new buildings, all in the French on for the BSL level lab, BSL-4 level lab, the sensitive lab, where they could do the most sensitive research and dangerous research safely if it's well run. They were going to be training on the Chinese how to use it. Well, they never got to train them. They helped oversee the construction. Then they were evicted, and it was lights out to the French. Well, I mean, why didn't Dr. Fauci and Dr. Collins say, we better not be working with these Chinese in Wuhan at that same lab and sending them money when that happened. There was a clear warning sign, and the French intelligence service has been quoted in the French, like Le Figaro newspaper and other newspapers. They said this is a sign of a WMD program. I mean, how did we not know this at the State Department? How did we not know this? But again,
let's take a step back, because here's what I'm trying to understand as someone who has been interested in the topic but isn't particularly well versed in any of the subject matter. What has really changed in the debate over the origins of the virus and the nature of the lab over the past 2 months?
The lab leak hypothesis, which was downplayed by about 99% of all scientists in the world, has suddenly gained ground as at least a 50-50 chance. It was downplayed by the DNI in testimony to Congress in April of last year. They said it was almost certainly natural. Okay, they've gone from the DNI under this administration has changed the view to they have low to mid confidence, which is almost no confidence in my experience in the IC, in a natural origin, and they also have low to mid confidence in a supernatural, we'll say lab-based origin, which means after a year and a half, as with the Salvador Dali painting where the clocks have melted, we still don't know what the heck's going on. But we do have a lot of facts that support the lab leak hypothesis, and they are facts. One of the biggest facts is China's own systematic cover-up, which I've never seen in 3 decades of working on China and spending, over a year of my life living there, and studying their languages and all that, yada, yada. I've never seen a cover-up like this. Even Tiananmen wasn't a cover-up at this level of extent. It wasn't the Chinese Communist government didn't admit Tiananmen. They said it was necessary. They've admitted nothing. They've told us nothing.
Just why I'm curious is the cover-up, that was happening January 2020, right? January 2020, February.
In November 2019.
So what, I guess what I'm just trying to understand, though, is what changed in the discourse? What facts emerged recently that caused such a pivot in terms of the rhetorical acceptability of there being a lab leak?
Well, the biggest thing is that we started to put pressure. I think at the Hudson Institute, we had the first DC event a month in March with, it was totally bipartisan. It was with Jamie Metzel and Andy Weber, who are both, former senior officials under Jamie worked for Senator Biden for 4 years on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I believe, if I recall it right. And Andy was the Assistant Secretary for Nuclear, Biological, Chemical at DOD under Obama. There, we had them, and then Miles Yu and myself representing what we learned at the State Department. And we reached a real strong consensus among the four of us that the lab leak was the dominant hypothesis, and it needed to be investigated. And then we started to make a lot of noise at the same time that I think that folks in the administration, at the NSC particularly, not at the State Department, which has totally abrogated its function of doing arms control related investigations, it seems, according to Secretary Blinken's recent testimony. He says they're not needed, which is ridiculous, or something to that effect, and criticized my effort as unprofessional, which it certainly wasn't. I had dozens of scientists from all the major national laboratories working as a team. We don't do that too often at the State Department to evaluate these claims. And, what we said publicly, the Secretary of State on January 15th put out a fact sheet with some critical information on the role of that lab, the role of its researchers, and advanced coronavirus research using so-called gain of function to enhance the pathogenicity of the coronavirus. And what we put in the fact sheet was that they were using the so-called Yunnan harvested bat coronavirus from 2012, which the Chinese assert, which we still can't necessarily prove, was the first time in history that people had contracted COVID, a coronavirus variant.
This is the miners in the cave.
They died of being exposed to a bat. And one of the things I did as part of my work was I called zookeepers that run bat caves, including here in DC. And I asked that, in this case, one of the veterinarians, I said, when do you get bit? And they're like, yeah, bats sometimes do bite. I mean, you get COVID from bats? This has become quite a topic since Jon Stewart mockingly, looked at this on Colbert the other night. But it's not a joking matter, really. I mean, they said no one's ever gotten COVID. I said, do you have bats that are similar to the bats in Wuhan? Yeah, we do. Horseshoe bats. They're related to them. But no one's ever gotten a coronavirus. So I said, do we get them in Austin, Texas? Do we get them they're bats in my house here at Gibson Island when I went in the attic the other day to kick some of them out. I don't get coronavirus. Where is the coronavirus transmission? The reality is we don't even know if the Chinese are telling the truth about these workers falling deathly ill. We know that in that bat cave, there was harvested a genetic predecessor that the Chinese have titled Rat G13 that appears to be the backbone of COVID-19. Okay, but it's 4 generations, maybe 6 of evolution away from COVID-19 itself. But it does seem to be the only known predecessor.
So the miners in the cave story could just be a cover story.
It could be a cover story. The Chinese use cover stories all the time because what they could have done is that there's some new research that's come out from a reputable source in a group of Chinese expats who are not tied into this Miles Guo guy or anything like that. They're much more mainstream, where they've looked at, they say there were about 4 years of bats being harvested in that cave, including funded by NIH through this thing called the Eco Health Alliance in New York. So I would assume we have some good data at NIH that they never shared with the State Department on, what was being harvested there. And, the Chinese had a database that they took down in September 2019 with about 15,000 bat coronaviruses that they had harvested and sampled. And that database mysteriously went offline just before, all heck breaks loose in Wuhan. Again, quite possibly having started now in mid-October, well before we said it started, because we don't know exactly when this thing started. The Chinese haven't told us. But there's increasing scientific suspicion based on blood that's been sampled that the Wall Street Journal's written about in Americans that they had exposure to COVID in at least early December of last year, which implied it would probably have to have started in October to have made its way around the world the way it did, is the view of the epidemiologists I've consulted. But the key point here is they were doing research with the only known predecessor. It's a deadly variant, okay? They say it killed these miners. 3 miners died, 6 total got sick. Okay, and now Xi Jiangli, the head of the so-called bat lady or bat woman, who's the head of the level 3 lab at Wuhan and one of the leaders of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, did an interview with the New York Times 2 days ago, and what did she say? Well, we're doing research with live bats, and so it's not just bat fecal swabs that they sample. They actually brought the bats back, it seems, maybe from Yunnan itself, and had a bat cave at the Wuhan Institute, which is something I totally believe. There's definitely a bat cave at the Wuhan CDC because I've been there. And they work with the Wuhan Institute very closely. So they're both Chinese government entities working on bat coronaviruses. So, even if they had live bats at least since 2017, it appears, at the Wuhan Institute, maybe for a whole decade before this. The key thing is these bats, if they're descendant of that rat G13, are totally deadly. Where did she say in her interview they're being handled? The BSL-2 lab, which has the safety that Richard Ebright, the great biologist at Rutgers, has said that has the lab safety of a dentist's office. She told the New York Times 2 days ago that this work is being done in a BSL-2 lab. That they're dealing with the most deadly coronavirus ever harvested from bats in a level 2 lab. That's insane. That would explain pretty much how this thing could leak out.
Quick question, because it's interesting that we're in a situation where there's so little transparency, yet a director is doing an interview with the New York Times. How are we finding out information? Why would she speak to the New York Times? How does that process work?
How does the process work with the Chinese communists? Well, first principle in a situation like this, when their lips are moving, they're lying, because if they tell the truth, they're going to get killed or sent to jail, and their families will be expunged, quite possibly. China's starting to act a little bit like North Korea, in my experience, or the Soviet Union back in the 60s and 70s. I mean, you got it's not just the Uyghurs that are being sent to gulags. But the point is, she did this interview because the Chinese government's under tremendous pressure, including from the G7 now, to come forward. Now, the G7 wasn't a great success, but at least they put out a statement the Chinese should need to take responsibility. Biden is, from what I hear from friends over in his world, is totally exasperated at the lack of cooperation from Beijing. And frankly, there's a lot of disturbing information that I can't talk about that we collected when I was at State that we didn't declassify. And I'm sure they're following up on the same leads that we had initiated. One of the things that's disturbing, it's not in any way classified. The information in their fact sheet was declassified for a reason. But what's important for our audience at Hudson is to understand that the date of most of the information that came out in that fact sheet was November, December of 2019. So we're dealing with we actually as a government had information, obviously, from a variety of sources of what was going on in Wuhan as this began, and it wasn't reported. It reminds me exactly of what I found when I worked at State before and after 9/11. We knew, so this was a case where the U.S. government either sitting on information that didn't disseminate that none of us at State saw until the fall of last year, that we immediately, because some people are questioning whether we tried to cover it up. Well, we didn't know about it. The second it came across my desk and Assistant Secretary Stilwell's desk and Miles Yu's desk, and we all saw it at the same time, roughly. We brought it right to the attention of the Secretary of State, through his team, and he read it and he had the same view. Oh my God, this is looks like confirmation that whatever he said based on whatever source in April, which I'm not privy to. So it probably was a pretty darn sensitive source, and certainly seemed to have been accurate. It was verified by the information we put in the fact sheet. But why does it take a year for it to come across the desks of the people in charge of this stuff for the U.S. State Department, which I had been put in charge of the investigation by the secretary? So, I mean, we have failures on a multiplicity of levels. Our government was funding research that's being done at that lab that even as the French got kicked out, we accelerated our funding. USAID, by the way, was the biggest funding agency. How did AID get involved in trying to stop outbreaks of, the plague, essentially? I mean, how does that fit in their mission?
Let me stop you there, because I would like us to discuss some of the politics of this question, both in terms of the national politics, but also the intragovernmental politics. Let's just start with the national politics, because I still am having trouble connecting up all the dots. I'm looking at an article on my computer right now from Politico, very recent article, in which they are arguing that the Trump administration actually exaggerated the connection, exaggerated the evidence in favor of the lab leak theory. So you seem to be saying that that actually it's the opposite. Trump is no longer in office, and now Biden is in office, and you're saying that there's increasing evidence that there's no evidence for the natural transmission. There's increasing evidence of at least strongly suggesting the lab leak theory. And here comes Politico saying, no, that's been terribly exaggerated. And they're quoting people from the IC, from the intelligence community, in support of their thesis. Politico is.
Well,
why?
I can't comment on what the IC did, is doing, etc. But I will tell you, having worked in it, it's not always so intelligent. Don't think that people ask questions. Don't think that people use the scientific method in the IC. If you apply a Bayesian statistical approach, which you use typically, like we do it in crime scene investigations, as you know, I've been a little bit involved with the DEA in my career as well, so I know something about that, as well as investigations into proliferation networks. We never have the full picture. Like on AQCon, it was a fragmentary picture, and North Korean HEU was a fragmentary picture. What do? Well, you do something that involves induction and deduction. Okay, you're a detective. You got to have a hypothesis. You got to disprove it. Okay, the role of science is to basically try to disprove things as part of proving them. Okay, like you can't, they can't. I don't know what the intelligence community had in its brain collectively when they told the DNI in April of last year to go in front of the Congress and say there was almost no probability of this coming out of a lab, when there was data that totally contradicted that even at that time. And there's a history of lab leaks in China, including from the Wuhan Institute. Now, we have a history of lab leaks ourselves, but we weren't trying to build a hyper deadly pathogen secretly, which the Chinese, we put in our declassified fact sheet they were doing, in a lab, which happens to be centered in the city where this thing broke out. I mean, just the odds of those facts, as Jon Stewart sort of was joking the other day. I mean, did the pangolin bite the turtle, as he said? How do you get the receptor binder of a pangolin combined genetically? And I've asked scientists this, and they don't explain it, with the backbone of a bat, this rat G13, Yunnan bat particularly, which only was harvested by the people at Wuhan Institute of Virology. We don't know that anyone is, other than those miners who were looking for it, ever got exposed to it and ever died of it. So we don't even know if they even died of it, if that could be a fake story. But the point is, they were doing this research. It was classified. The Chinese could have, if they were going to do declassified research that wasn't related to WMD, and it was defensive in nature, they have every good reason to put it in the list of dozens of things they declare under the BWC each year that they're doing biological research on. Mysteriously, the same year they kicked off this rat G13 research, they stopped declaring SARS as an area of biodefense research to the Bioweapons Convention in Geneva. Now, is that a coincidence because they decided to put this into a classified offense program? I mean, it wasn't, they had declared it for a decade before as a core area of biodefense concern. That's not classified. You could have to dig through the UN's website to figure out where it is, but it's public information. At least the public's entitled to see it because it's not classified, and not even SBU, as we say, sensitive but unclassified. So what were the Chinese doing there? Why were they messing with this thing? Why was the PLA involved in funding it? That's very curious. I mean, our Army funds biodefense research, but we declare it. We do biodefense research at Lawrence Livermore and Edgewood National Laboratories. We declare it. If we say we're doing work with SARS, we declare it. They stopped declaring it. And they declared Nipah, chikungunya, Ebola, like dozens of other things. But suddenly, if you look at their own declarations, they stopped in 2016 declaring this. And now Xi Jinping goes on TV and says, well, yeah, first she says they weren't doing any gain of function research, totally contradicted by her own published papers, including with Professor Ralph Barrick from the University of North Carolina, where they created a new variant of SARS that was dramatically enhancing the pathogenicity and contagiousness, is the right word, of that artificially created COVID. Dr. Barrick took the published sequence of SARS-CoV-2 and 2 days after it was posted, reverse engineered it in a lab and developed a synthetic version of it. So obviously, by the way, so did Moderna, so did Biogen, so did every major drug company working on COVID. They didn't have to go, they just took the sequence and they put it into, genetic bioreactors and they were able to reproduce it. This is the thing. There's no regulation on that technology. The Chinese are like the Wild West. NIH loves it to use it as a playground because you can do human experiments way before you can anywhere else in the world. So there's all sorts of conflicts of interest embedded. So we got sucked into this thing. NIH got sucked into it. A bunch of other U.S. agencies, including DTRA, which is supposed to reduce threats, not increase them. So Defense Threat Reduction Agency.
One of the things that seems plausible to me, I'm just trying to read the politics of this, is that I'm wondering why we're not going on offense on this, why the Biden administration isn't going on offense on this. And it seems to me, help me understand this. It seems to me that what you're saying is that the United States, including Dr. Fauci, is deeply implicated here.
Yes.
Not in terms of the leak, but of incredibly bad judgment
Yes.
of funding
Yes.
research into related questions. Am I off base here in thinking that the reticence of the Biden administration, or at least the and its allies, may have something to do with the fact that there's a lot of embarrassment here with the DEA and with Dr. Fauci, and can you help us understand what exactly gain of function research is and why Dr. Fauci was funding it?
Well, Dr. Fauci has made it his cause celeb with Dr. Collins. They wrote an op-ed, I think, in 2012 or 2013 for the Washington Post. Why we gain of function research, where you create artificial viruses based around real ones that are dramatically more lethal, and then you try to study how to defend against them. Well, so far.
So we were helping the Chinese develop bioweapons.
In
basically,
fact, what you're doing is you're creating a bioweapon capability. It's a dual use. It's called a DIRC, dual use research of concern.
Why on earth would Dr. Fauci think that creating sort of lethal strains of COVID in the Wuhan Institute of Virology with American dollars was a wise thing to do? What was the train of thought?
I don't know. I talked to the NIH leadership and they never gave me an explanation. And I said, certainly you've got risk assessments you could send us. But the thing is, I was investigating the Chinese government, not the U.S. But the way I figured out what the U.S. was doing was by investigating the Chinese. I kept running into U.S. grants and research and U.S. researchers in bed with the Chinese lab that we were concerned had leaked this thing, had developed it and leaked it, and it was funded by the People's Liberation Army to develop it, not to release it. We had no knowledge that I ever saw that implied deliberate. We did see things that I can't talk about. I did have lots of interviews with foreigners who had worked in Wuhan with the people in that lab, were in direct email and signal and other contact with those people, even as this was occurring. So I went and did, we knew at state, it's not the IC. We sent out cables to our posts and we asked, call in all the scientists that you can find in each one of your posts in your country where you're located, and who had worked in Wuhan, and find out what they know. Well, we found out an awful lot just based on that. And what we found out is that there were people in that lab who apparently, not only fell sick in November, and this came from State Department non-classified information. Almost all of our cables related to this topic were sensitive but unclassified or unclassified. I mean, we did have some classified cables, and we did have some people that will say, people can walk into a U.S. embassy and ask to talk to the State Department. And they'll really, if they don't want to talk to an intelligence agency, they're going to talk. They have to ask to do that. They want to talk to state will talk to them. And so we collect a lot of independent corroborating information that, frankly, a series of accidents and mishaps occurred involving the most dangerous, convolutional, developed dual use capability funded by the People's Liberation Army in that lab. And one of the first, maybe the first cluster of people to fall sick we knew about was in the Wuhan Institute itself. And they were people who apparently were working on COVID-19. And that doesn't come out of the US government fact sheet. That comes out of an interview I did with two foreign government scientists who were working there in that time period. And so they told me what they believed had happened. And I asked how did they find out? Well, I'm not going to say who they talked to in the staff of the Wuhan Institute, but they certainly talked to them.
Where does all of this lead us? Where there's an unclear picture. We know there's a lot of different things going on. Like where should policymakers focus, folks in the Hudson audience, where should we think of how this is going to go next?
Well, I put out a policy memo, which I hope people would be kind enough to read for Hudson on June, in June. called A Just Response, which we're in June, excuse me. We wrote most of it in May, I would to say. But A Just Response to Beijing's COVID-19 Abuses. It was by myself, Tom DeNanno, David Fife, Miles Yu, Matt Zweig. All of us were involved in this thing at one level or another. Matt was a sanctions expert, working mostly on Syria, but he's a true expert on sanctions. We need sanctions. We need to unleash the ambulance-chasing lawyers of America. We need to stop funding dangerous research with the Chinese, communists particularly. We should enforce treaty compliance. The biological weapons treaty was trampled on, and it has little credibility to begin with. It has no credibility now. And then we need responsible pandemic preparedness. We need to get ahead. We have the ability, and of all people, for me to plug, but I'm going to plug the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. They put together a scientific concept, which they've already demonstrated, called BioHub, where they use biosensors using next generation genomic sequencing technology, which works extraordinarily fast and precisely, and other techniques to sample blood, sample sewage, sample the air, and other sources. And the idea is if the Chinese want to cooperate, they want to show they're sincere, they got to join this thing. If they don't want to get sanctioned, they're going to have to cooperate and transfer samples and give us access to the lab and notebooks and all that stuff. If they don't, in 6 months, we should unleash what Juan Zarate, my friend, calls the financial furies. We could bring the Chinese, the cost of doing business with the United States for China we could start to impart a very high cost through coercive diplomacy.
If I were speaking purely theoretically, because I'm as far as you can get from being an expert on any of this. If I wanted to ask why the U.S. government hasn't already started moving in that direction, I would say 3 major reasons. The first was that while Trump was president, there was all the politics of Donald Trump's presidency that got in the way. Since Trump has left, we have 2 other factors which were also operative under Trump. Factor number 1 is the United States government, multiple agencies in the United States government, and the sainted Dr. Fauci are dirty on this. At least they're implicated. They have carried out policies that were very unwise.
Yeah.
The third reason is that we don't want to unleash the financial furies because we fear the Chinese counter reaction. So we don't want to admit the magnitude of the problem, not just because the problem is going to be very embarrassing for us, but because that will then put pressure on our government to take actions that it actually doesn't want to take.
Well, it's too bad. I mean, we were prepared under the Trump administration to take these actions. We drafted an executive order specific to sanction the Chinese government. It was circulating at the NSC before the election, and then obviously with the election, it dissipated. But that's still inside the State Department non-proliferation arms control bureaucracy. I'd add another reason. The non-proliferation people at state, who are not the arms control people, or different bureaus, proliferated. So, why they did that, I don't know. But I do think they need to be blamed. I think they needed to be investigated. And I look forward in closing to testifying to Congress under oath alongside these people. I have no problem. My conscience is clear. I did the best job I possibly could in a limited amount of time with the incredible team of people, including some of the greatest scientists in the world, most of whom refused to be recognized in closing because they didn't want the Chinese to stop funding their research centers. They didn't want to lose access to China, but they did cooperate mostly quietly with the State Department, and what they told us was highly disturbing, including about themselves.
So, David, thank you so much for joining us. It's clear there's a lot of great Hudson resources that we will include at our website, hudson.org, to check out moving forward, from the memos to the events to this podcast. Thank you so much. Huge thank you to Hudson for supporting the work of Mike and I on Counterbalance. We'll see you all next week.